Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's Author Talk series brought to you by the Library Speakers Consortium. The Library Speakers Consortium is a partnership of more than 200 library systems across 37 states with the goal of making Author Talks more accessible to communities of all sizes. I am Brandon Adler, your host and moderator in conversation with each of the wonderful best-selling, prize-winning, and acclaimed authors that you will hear from year-round throughout the Author Talk series. Today, we are honored and excited to have best-selling and award-winning author Geraldine Brooks with us to talk about her most recent New York Times bestseller, Horse. Before we begin, though, for those of you who are watching an LSC Author Talk for the first time, or those of you who need a reminder, let me pause and give you all that standard housekeeping information that ensures a smooth experience for everyone during the talk today. And then we'll dive right in and learn a little bit more about our guest. We have compiled some viewer questions that were pre-submitted with registration, but we will also be taking your additional questions throughout our conversation. So when you have a direct question for Geraldine, you can go ahead and click that questions button that's just below the live stream video. Please keep in mind there are a lot of you tuning in today, so we will get to as many viewer questions as possible. In addition, we invite you to interact with your fellow viewers in the live chat box, also located below this stream. It's always fun to see where everybody's tuning in from. If you're unable to attend the full talk for any reason, you will receive a thank you for attending email in about 24 hours, and in that email you can find a link to the recording. Now, to formally introduce our guest for today, Geraldine Brooks is the author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning novel March and the international bestsellers The Secret of the Cord, Caleb's Crossing, People of the Book, Year of Wonders, and the title of note for today, Horse. She has also written the acclaimed nonfiction works 9 Parts of Desire and Foreign Correspondence. Born and raised in Australia, Geraldine lives in Massachusetts, where she serves as a conservation commissioner in the town of West Tisbury. Welcome, Geraldine. Thank you so much for being here tonight.
Hi, Brandon. It's great to be with you.
How are you doing today? I know that this is it's a good evening time. It's not too late, not too early.
Around here it started to get dark at 4, so I feel like it's already midnight. I have a lot of trouble adjusting to the early onset darkness at this time of year.
Yeah, I think you're probably not alone there. Well, to jump right in, I know that not everybody watching today has had the opportunity to fully read through the book Horse yet. Can you give a quick summary of the book?
Yeah, it is a triple braided narrative, and I would say the most important strand of the story is the true story of the most remarkable racehorse of the 19th century, who was called Lexington, and he was both blisteringly fast and had incredible endurance and an amazing life story with many twists and turns in it. He raced before the Civil War and then was a great, remarkable stud sire during the Civil War and was at risk at that time during the Civil War. So his story is full of incidents, and the people around him are particularly fascinating. He was trained initially by a black horseman who had been enslaved but had earned his own emancipation, and he was surrounded by enslaved black horsemen who were responsible for his care. And his owners were pretty interesting, very diverse set of characters themselves. So that's the historical heart. Then there's a contemporary strand of the novel that looks at what happens when his skeleton has been given to the Smithsonian and all the science around that skeleton that was happening in contemporary times. And then there are paintings of the horse, and that unexpectedly leads to a connection with the art movement post-World War II in New York City at the birth of abstract expressionism, where a painting of Lexington turns up in very unexpected hands. So that is all, based on true story, but obviously, where the facts became scarce, that's where the novelist's imagination kicks in.
So in the afterword of the book, you mention how the book was born out of this curiosity about the skeleton of Lexington, as you mentioned. Um, what what was it about this artifact that kind of stoked your curiosity? And Sally and Andrea would like to know specifically what inspired the writing of horse.
Well, what inspired the writing, to be absolutely honest, was the fact that I became horse crazy at an inconveniently old age. Most people who are going to become horse crazy do it at the sensible age of 5 or 15, and start riding ponies and fall off when they can still bounce without breaking. But I didn't become horse crazy till I was in my 50s. But when it hits you, it hits hard. And I went for a great ride in New Mexico, and I came back completely passionate about everything to do with horses. And then somebody offered me a horse, and suddenly I had a horse at home. And all I wanted to do was think about horses. And it was just lucky for me that I was at a luncheon at Plymouth Museum, and also at that luncheon was a gentleman from the Smithsonian who had just delivered the skeleton of this horse from an attic in Washington to centerpiece of an exhibition on the history of the thoroughbred in America. So this horse was so famous in his own time, and then he'd kind of fallen out of celebrity, and his skeleton had been stashed away, and then now it's back in a room of its own at the International Museum of the Horse in Kentucky.
On display in a room of its own?
Yes, on display as the centerpiece, because of all the horses, this horse was really responsible for the fact that Lexington, Kentucky is the center of thoroughbred breeding and racing in the United States, because he became the most successful stud sire in the history of racing.
Fascinating. Michael would like to know, so writing your novels, and horse in particular, what's the research process? What is the balance between historical fact and dramatic fiction? I know that you already kind of touched on, the novelist gets to fill in the rest. But how far from established historical records can you and do you feel comfortable taking the fictional narrative?
Well, I never take it until I have to, because I believe what Mark Twain said. I've quoted it in the aftermatter in the book. Mark Twain said, fiction is obliged to stick to possibilities. Truth isn't. And, the truth is always the best, because the things that actually happened are more unlikely than anything you could create. And when you're reading this novel, I can tell you, heads up, the things that seem most unlikely are the true things. So the fact that a painting was found in a junk pile that led to the rediscovery of the painter Thomas Scott and his work. The fact that there's a direct connection between a 19th century racehorse and Jackson Pollock, which I never expected as I started to research the novel. So what I do is I really want the story to drive the work. I don't do all the research up front, because I think if you do that, you run a risk of finding out something really interesting and just cramming it into the novel, whether the story needs it or not. So what I do is typically just enough research to get started. And then once I get started, the story tells me what I need to know. And then I go and find that out. And so the research and the writing are kind of interwoven.
Okay. You mentioned Jackson Pollock. How did you stumble upon that connection between Jackson
when I was researching the contemporary thread of the novel, I wanted to find out what they actually do with bones at the Smithsonian. And that turned out to be super intriguing. I mean, I really love this about being a novelist, is that you have an excuse to bother people about their jobs and find out what they do. So I was out at the Museum Support Center in Maryland, which is the most fantastic place. If you like the Smithsonian museums, I have to tell you, it's not even the tip of the iceberg. It is the tip of the tip of the iceberg. The real action It's happening out in suburban Maryland. There's this enormous campus for the Museum Support Center. And it's storage pods, gigantic buildings all linked together by this kind of enclosed corridor that they call the street. And it's an example of every living creature on earth, and also some of the greatest artworks of the human hand and mind, and crazy historical artifacts. And you're standing there, and the stuff that's going by you just your chin is on your chest. There's this one direction is coming a triceratops head, and the other direction is going an old master's painting, and it's just a fantastic place. And so I was there to look at the work of the osteopreparators, the people who get the bones ready for scientists to study. And that was fascinating. But while I was there, an art conservator told me that they had a painting of Lexington in their collection, and would I like to see it? And so it wasn't on display, of course. 98% of the stuff they have is not on display. So we went to a study area and saw this painting. And the conservator said, this is really interesting. This came to us in a bequest, and there's nothing else like it in the bequest. The rest of the bequest is this edgy contemporary art from, the beginning of the abstract expressionist movement. And it's a bequest from Martha Jackson, who is a famous feminist gallerist who had a great instinct for identifying the artists who were going to be important even before anybody else appreciated their work. And one of the artists she appreciated was Jackson Pollock. And I'm not going to tell you more about how those things connect, because you'll have to read the novel.
So Amy is asking, what were your most influential sources of information, of course, besides the Smithsonian, about the day-to-day lives of slaves and other general sources? And Christine and Mia are kind of piggybacking on that and saying, how did you research the life experience and viewpoints of enslaved people for that period?
Yeah, that's definitely the hardest research task that I had, because generally, enslaved people were not allowed to become literate. It was against the law in many states to teach a slave to read and write. So they didn't get down to set down their own experiences very often. But the interesting thing about the Black Horsemen, and they were all men, of course, in those days, is that they occupied such an important niche in the lives of the thoroughbred owners, because these white guys derived so much wealth and prestige from their racehorses. So the men who looked after them and whose expertise these white guys relied on got a lot more respect and attention than other enslaved people. So you start to find them first in the correspondence between the thoroughbred owners, and they're kind of almost bragging on the expertise of their Black horsemen. But there's a real deference and respect that you don't see in white discussion of enslaved people generally. So that was intriguing. And then the newspapers of the time, because racing was such a huge thing in the 19th century, it was the sport. It was bigger than NFL is today. It would be NFL if we all had helmet and pads in our closet and went out and played football every other day, because everybody had a horse and they all had opinions about horses and loved to watch great horses race. And there was a lot of entrepreneurship in the promotion of horse racing. So people were very excited about it. And there were 3 newspapers that covered only racehorses. And so in those newspapers, you can find also traces of these guys, the enslaved experts. And some of it is pretty racist, but occasionally you just get glimpses of the situation that these men were in, where they had a skill that was highly valued, and that earned them a measure of respect and attention. And there are a few oral histories, and you have to take those with a grain of salt, because invariably with the ones I found, oral histories are being taken down by a white interlocutor. And so you have to say, okay, is this guy really, is he free to speak freely to this person? Mm-hmm. So with that caveat, but then I also relied on the work of real historians who've dug deep into the living conditions the mores around marriage, slave marriage, and the material situation of enslaved people. So, I was resting on the back of a lot of really serious historical research, mainly by, Black historians.
Mm-hmm. So how long did the research and writing process take for this book?
Too long. It took a long time, but there are a couple of reasons for that, So I had a catastrophe in my personal life in the middle of writing this book when my husband died suddenly. And, my life was completely sideways for more than a year. And so when I finally got back to the book, it was I found that working on the book was kind of the lifeboat that I crawled back into, because I really needed to finish it, because my husband had loved this subject very much and was a great supporter of me. He was the real historian in the family, Tony Horwitz, and he knew this period very well. So he was always bringing me, love notes in the form of terrific finds from the archives that he dug up for me. So I had to finish this book just so I could dedicate it to him.
Mm-hmm. I'm very sorry for your loss. So let's ask a bit of a transition into the characters then. So at what point were you aware of the relationship between Lexington and Jarret, his groom?
Almost immediately.
Okay.
So Jarret existed. There's a painting of Lexington being led out by Black Jarret, his groom. And unfortunately, that painting is missing. We don't know where it is. But so that set me off on, and because I have a horse and because I spend a lot of time with my horse, I know that it's the grooms that count the most to the horses. It's not the owners or the jockeys or even the trainers. It's the groom that's there every morning with the bucket of grain. It's the groom that's tending their hurts and brushing them and spending time with them. And so I knew that the groom was going to be the central relationship. And then a real historian who's worked on this found a reference to Jarret in a letter from the last owner of Lexington, saying, what a first-class groom he had. And so it was very easy to imagine what that relationship would have been like. And less easy to imagine, the circumstances of Jarret's life. But he did make it to emancipation and was a free man at the end of his life, which was, that was good to know.
Yeah, that would be a wonderful thing to find out, especially after all of the research. Can we talk about what an inspirational character Jarret is? Joe is saying the empathy and strength he exhibits, even in the light of such cruelty at times, sometimes brought me to tears. As he's leaving Natchez and the fatherland, he even states that he wasn't sorry to have seen what he'd seen and to have learned what he learned. And that there was space in his soul for the suffering of people. Did you intend to write Jarret as such a compassionate and empathetic character, or did it just kind of come together that way? Or is that what you found out about him through research?
No, I just, you don't really know where a character's arc is going to go. And I don't really know any details of the real Jarret beyond the bare fact that he existed and was with the horse at the end of his life, and that he was a first-class groom, and that he was a free man at the end of his life, but was still working with the horse, which I thought was really interesting. So I built the character out of an understanding of what it means to have a relationship with a horse, because I love animals and I grew up with dogs and I love dogs, and I've got a dog snoring right here on the couch next to me even now. But dogs and people look at the world the same way. We're both predators. We're both eyes right in the front of our heads looking for our next meal. Horses are prey animals, so their eyes are in the sides of their heads so they can look around them to see what's coming to make them their next meal. And when you can cross that interspecies barrier and earn the trust of a prey animal when you're a predator, it's a very profound thing, and it takes time and it takes patience and sensitivity. And it is so super rewarding. So it's taking my knowledge of that relationship and thinking about what kind of youth would you have to be to have that relationship. And that's where Jarret came from. Also, he's got a little bit of my teenage son in him. Who is a guy who keeps his own counsel, but has a lot of very deep waters roiling underneath. And so, characters come from all kinds of places.
You did mention Jarret's emancipation earlier, and so we got a couple of questions about that. Karma and Kathy say that they're curious why you didn't explore Jarret's emancipation a bit more. That it seemed that there was still something that they needed to know, and they wonder how much of the story is based on real historical information or if that was all fiction.
So what I do know is Alexander, who owned the farm where Lexington wound up for his stud career in his last years. And that's where you can find Jarret in the farm records. Alexander was not unique, but quite unusual in that he started paying his enslaved people wages as soon as the Emancipation Proclamation was issued by Lincoln. He didn't have to do that technically because Kentucky was on the Union side at that point, and the Emancipation Proclamation only covered enslaved people in the rebellious states. So Alexander did that. So at that point, you can say that Jarret is emancipated. He's being paid for his labor. And at that point, if he wanted to go, he could have gone. He could have joined the Union Army had he wanted to. But he stayed on. So that's all I know for sure.
Yeah, he stayed on because I believe he says that a soldier isn't free, right?
Well, I'm just hypothesizing because, at that point I've come to believe he's a really smart guy. And why on earth, would you put yourself under the command of some other white guy who you don't even know when you're finally getting the respect that you deserve and getting paid for your work and you've got a position of relative prestige? Why on earth? I mean, so that's just me talking.
Sorry, there's a mosquito flying around in front of me. Unfortunately, it's not cold enough here for them to die yet. So you stated in other interviews that as you researched Lexington's life, that this novel could not merely be about a racehorse. It also needed to be about race. And Bobby is stating and asking, you tell many stories in horse. Some naturally overlap, for example, the discovery of Lexington's paintings and his bones. The racial story is moving and important, although Bobby thought that it seemed more separate from Lexington's story and wants to know, how did you come to the decision to include it? And I guess to further that question, why is horse racing and its history an ideal lens through which to explore those questions of racism?
Well, it's a pretty tragic story, racing and race, because this industry was built on the plundered labor and skills of enslaved Black horsemen prior to the Civil War. And then after Reconstruction, there's a tremendous backlash against the Black horsemen and the Black jockeys, particularly. It becomes impossible for a Black jockey to race. The white jockeys would gang up against them and make it unsafe for them in races. But I think it's something like, I can't remember the exact number, but really high proportion of the jockeys that raced in the first Kentucky Derbies, and the winners were all black jockeys. And then suddenly there are no black jockeys in horse racing for 100 years.
Wow.
And that was racism at work.
Mm-hmm.
And so once I understood that Lexington had been trained to his initial success by a very esteemed black trainer, and that Jarret, his black groom, was so instrumental in his life, I couldn't leave these guys out of the story. And then so once you're talking about racism in the 19th century, if you've got a contemporary story, you can't leave it out of that either, because that would be like saying, oh, well, that story of racism, oh, that's all over and done with after emancipation. We don't have to worry our pretty heads about that anymore. Well, obviously, that's not true. And as I was writing this book, the noise was extremely loud about the reckoning with racism in our current situation. So I had to have that story reverberate in the contemporary thread as well.
Good. I think you weaved it together wonderfully. That was a very important story to tell. So Abby is saying, did you choose to have Theo be from Lagos rather than a black man brought up in the US for any particular reason? And similarly, have Jess be Australian rather than American? How did you intend their relationship to relate back to Jarret?
So, okay, I'll just tell you the truth. Jess was my easy character. I had so many characters that I had to do so much work to make right and research. And I thought, I'm just going to give myself a break here. Just going to make Jess just like me, you know. So I was that nerdy kid from a lower middle class home in inner city Sydney who loved the natural world and who did find an electrocuted bat and mount the skeleton, and you know, and and came to this country kind of blockheaded about, you know, the nuances of race in this country. So I just based her on me essentially. So that was Jess. Why is Theo partly Nigerian? I just wanted to complicate it a little bit because one of my friends here where I live on Martha's Vineyard is Skip Gates, and he has a class he gives at Harvard. And, you know, the first thing he says to his students is there are 20 million ways to be Black in America. And that really stuck with me. And I also wanted him to be a little bit of an outsider in this society as well, so that it's two kind of awkward outsiders who meet each other, united by an interest in this horse, and also one thing I've learned from my Black friends on Martha's Vineyard, which is a pretty privileged bunch of people, you know, they're incredibly educated and affluent community, and yet none of them have got out of this without some horrible experience at the hands of the criminal justice system, or, you know, some other huge humiliation by this society. So wealth and education is no protection. And I think maybe a lot of people will remember Henry Louis Gates, who's a professor at Harvard and a TV celebrity and a famous author, got pulled off his front porch in handcuffs because he was trying to open his stuck front door, and somebody saw a Black man in a fancy neighborhood in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and called the cops on him. And the cops overreacted when Skip was angry about being confronted trying to get into his own house, and he ended up in the slammer. And it's not just him. All of my friends have similar stories to relate. And I just thought it was really important to show that it doesn't matter how much education you've got or what neighborhood you live in. If your skin is Black, you're not ever 100% safe in this society.
Mm-hmm. Marcia says, I was struck by your writing about the experiences of Black people in our time, both the obvious and the subtle. what inspired you to write about how different Black people who were born here and have always lived here um, are from Black people who are foreign born? For example, Theo's friend thought Theo was naive um, and needed to gain more knowledge about how race relations worked in America. Um, so I guess her question is, how did you gain that knowledge? And I think you answered that partially just now.
Yeah, my oldest son was in college with some Black friends, some born and raised here, some whose families came, and they have a more like first generation immigrant experience,
Okay.
and they're different experiences, and I found it really interesting learning about that myself, and it intrigues me. And I did get very patient Black friends of mine to read early drafts of this manuscript, and a lot of what's in it in the final version is a reflection of the things that they had to say, filling me in on their own lived experience, which was very generous and patient, because there's nothing more tedious for a Black person than to explain racism, their own, a white person's own racism to them. But yet they did me the honor of taking the time to do that.
Betty just asked, could you please comment on the modern characters and how prejudice and sensitivity to prejudice continue to exist? I'm referring to the relationship between Jess and Theo and how it connects to Jarret's story, which I think we've touched on a bit.
Yeah, well, it wasn't clear to me that these two characters were going to have a romantic relationship, but as I started writing them, I thought, how can they not? They're both young, attractive, slightly fish out of watery types in Washington. It's obvious they're going to be attracted to each other. Even though there are some really good reasons why they shouldn't be. But that's how, in my experience, romances aren't always super convenient, and there are always roadblocks that have to be overcome.
Did you? So you said Jess is somewhat molded around you as the character. Do you yearn for Australia the way that Jess expresses over and over?
Yes, I have to say, I used to say to my husband, I'm in the United States for you, because his work as an American historian had to be done here, whereas my work can be done anywhere, really. So yeah, it's true. I miss Australia very much. I miss the insouciant humor of the place. I miss the banter, the daily banter. Australians are always kind of, we call it piss taking. I don't know if that's a phrase here that means the same thing, but just constantly joking with each other in a kind of deprecating way. And it's a really lovely place to live. What can I say? But I'd have to be churlish about living on Martha's Vineyard, which is also a lovely place to live in a wonderful community. So I'm very happy with the life I made here too.
Another question from Betty that was pre-submitted. I'm not sure if it's the same Betty or not. As you developed the plot, what other endings did you consider? Specifically, how did you decide on a job that brought Jess back to Australia? Is that because of, the character origination?
Oh, so if we're going to go there, we're going to get into some spoilers.
Okay, so let's save that then for the end. We're going to do something non-traditional and let everybody know that who hasn't read the book yet. Toward the end of the talk, we'll say, please leave if you haven't finished the book or read it yet, because we're going to get into some spoilers, because we had so many questions about it. Okay, so we will skip ahead then. We have a lot of questions about Thomas J. Scott.
Yeah, fascinating guy, absolutely.
Our first one comes from Micheline, I believe. I'm sorry if I'm saying that wrong. Could you clarify the paintings done by Thomas J. Scott? The first painting was found by Theo. The second painting was bought by Martha Jackson. What about the third painting? Which painting had Jarret in it?
So the third painting is the one that's missing,
Okay.
and it's described in the 19th century in a couple of different articles because it was thought to be the best painting that Scott had ever done, and it's of Lexington late in his life being led by Jarret. And they all talk about how the sensitivity of the artist, who had known the horse for a long time at that point, manages to show the power of the horse, but also the frailty of old age. And it sounds like a really amazing painting, but it hasn't been seen in 100 years. And so I wanted to bring that painting into the story and account for why it might not have been seen. So that's why what happens to that painting is what happens to that painting, but we really don't know. And it would be so exciting if somebody, said, "Oh, I've got a painting of a horse." And actually, I got an email this week from somebody who has a Thomas Scott painting that she bought at a yard sale in Minnesota for $3.
Much like the horse being found, Lexington being found.
The reason Thomas Scott was rediscovered as an artist was because a worker from the university in Kentucky plucked a painting out of his neighbor's junk pile and was intrigued by it and looked into who the artist was. And that led him to an art historian who studied the equestrian artists. And out of that became Thomas Scott's first posthumous survey exhibition. And he's been rediscovered as a very important equestrian artist of the 19th century. But he was more than an artist because he was a writer as well. So he's one of the characters in the book where I have examples of his writing in his own voice. So I was able to give him a first-person narrative because I felt confident about how he sounded. And he's also a guy that people noticed and wrote about. So the chaplain in his Civil War unit, when he was a volunteer on the Union side working as a medic, the chaplain wrote about him in great detail. And it's so fascinating. So I really felt like I got to know this artist, writer, soldier, medic, really intriguing guy.
That is intriguing. Linda and Thomas and Sarah, so many people asked about the multiple first-person narrators in the book, and specifically, why were the chapters devoted to the Thomas Scott narrative the only ones that seem to be written in the first person, and why did you choose to move the story along in this way?
So I like to write in first person, and I will always do that if I feel that I've got confidence about the voice. But I thought it would be ridiculous to assume that I could write a first person in Jarret's voice, knowing so little about the real Jarret. But with Thomas Scott, because I had all his writings and then I had people writing about him, I felt confident that I could convey something that might be a plausible facsimile of his voice. So that's why he gets a first person narrative.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So interestingly, I had two people submit comments and / questions about being related to Martha Jackson. Joan and Rick both say, well, Joan says, my grandmother, Doris Kellogg Neal, was Martha Jackson's aunt. My mother, Angelica Neal Miller, was Martha Jackson's first cousin. I'm interested to hear your motivation for writing her into the book. And Rick kind of says the same thing, and he's curious about how you found out about the Kellogg family. But I think you answered that with saying the Smithsonian.
Yeah, so the painting. So it was actually Martha Jackson's son who made this bequest to the Smithsonian. And every other painting in the bequest is some kind of edgy piece of contemporary art from the period. And yet there's this anomaly. There's this one 19th century oil painting of a racehorse. And why did she have that? This woman who is obsessed with contemporary art and, was renowned for her eye for contemporary art. From the time she was a very young woman. She came from a very privileged buffalo family, so she had some means, and she started collecting when she was very young, and her eye was impeccable, and she could see things before other people saw them. So I was intrigued by her just from a feminist point of view, that she busted into this male art world and succeeded in having an incredible instinct for what was going to be important in art. And yet I could not find out why she had this one traditional 19th century oil painting.
Well,
In her collection.
maybe Joan or Rick know.
Well, if they do, I'd love to hear. But I did find out that she was a really enthusiastic equestrian, and her mother was a famous equestrian competitor who did die in a freak accident. Really expert rider who had like trivial fall that should not have, been a thing for somebody who had competed at the levels she'd competed and done the crazy jumps that she could do in her sleep. And then she just had a crazy fall at the walk on a horse, and it killed her. And so I thought maybe there was some reason that Martha was attracted to this painting. Anyway, I had to make that bit up.
Okay. Well, we've had several questions about the title of the book. Al is asking, why horse versus a horse or the horse or Lexington?
Because after Lexington's fame and celebrity started to wane, about 100 years after the skeleton had come to the Smithsonian, the skeleton was put in the Hall of Mammals as an example of horse, next to an example of rabbit, next to an example of elk.
Oh, no.
And so for a long time, this famous, celebrated horse, Lexington, very specific horse, was just horse.
Is there a character, Diane is wondering, is there a character you wished you'd had more time to develop or had developed more extensively?
Not really. I mean, the beauty of being a novelist is your time's your own. They have to prize the manuscript from your cold dead hands. But no, I felt like I would have loved to have had more historical record of Jarret. I would have loved to have known more about the real Jarret. That wasn't possible. So, but as for the fictional Jarret, I feel very affectionate towards him, and I feel like I thought him through, and I know that he went on to live a very happy and satisfactory life. So, that's the beauty of being the novelist, because you know what happens to all your characters after.
Yeah. Or you write another one if you don't. Jackie is saying, what was your favorite part of the book to write? Was it Jarret?
I think that was hard because his life is you're always nervous for him, or at least I was. His situation is so precarious, and it shouldn't be. And so I was always a little bit on edge about him because I was so attached to him. I think the best thing about writing the book to me was that it gave me an excuse to really indulge my obsession with horses and just be reading everything I could find about horses and learning stuff about horses that don't apply to my relationship with a horse. Like, how do you train a racehorse to run a 4-mile race, and that kind of thing. So being able to get deep into the weeds on horses was really the best part of it for me at the time.
Anne is saying, even though each of your books takes place in different time periods and in vastly different locations, they reflect a shared belief that the past is never really past. What sparks that interest in you as a writer to explore and bring to light stories with such deep roots tangled in cultural identity?
I think I'm always looking for these stories from the past that wouldn't be interesting if you made them up. They would be implausible and ridiculous if they weren't true. I think possibly the clearest example of what I'm talking about here is Caleb's Crossing, which is the story of the first Native American to graduate from Harvard. And if I had made him up, that a Wampanoag youth raised in his own language and culture on the island of Martha's Vineyard had mastered Latin and Greek and gone off to study with the son of John Eliot and graduated from Harvard in 1665. That'd be ridiculous, but it actually happened. And that's why it appeals to me as a subject. And I'm also, I have a kind of a really deep interest that comes out of my 10 years as a foreign correspondent covering conflicts and wars and upheavals, about what happens to people when they're under pressure, what happens to people in times of catastrophe. Do you become your best self or your worst self? Because I saw examples of both when I was a reporter. And that question continues to intrigue me, and I like to explore it in my fiction.
Jeff is asking a question that's Year of Wonders inspired. He's saying, what are your thoughts about the commonalities of superstition, fear, and human nature in Year of Wonders and our own recent pandemic or plague? Who do you think fared better, the village of Ayam or New York City?
That was whack, actually. I mean, I was actually in Sydney visiting my sister when Wuhan locked down. And I thought, I wrote a book about something that happened in 1665. I never thought it would be happening in the 21st century.
Yeah.
And then, we're all standing in this crazy situation where superstition and science went to war with each other, just like they did in 1665. And I felt like we had not really advanced as a species, that we still, were locked in this battle between crazy belief and hard science. Although, the science, as it turned out, was a little bit mushy because they kept changing things. But that's how science works. You get new information and you test hypotheses. And I was just astonished by the similarities. And living on, I came back to Martha's Vineyard and we were in lockdown here. And this island was not like we're going into quarantine to protect other people. It was we're in quarantine to protect ourselves. So stay away. And there was a kind of for a while, a very angry, bitter attitude to people who were coming from New York to the island. And I just thought that it was incredibly ungenerous to say to people, you cannot come here. Mm-hmm. You have to stay in your high-rise building with a single elevator and die, rather than come to a house on 3 acres of land. Anyway, fortunately, it was a short-lived panic, and it turned out that people on this island were incredibly responsible. And we only had, one death that was tragic, but that was after the vaccines were available, and it was a person who had elected not to be vaccinated. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, Elaine is asking about People of the Book. She says, People of the Book is one of those works that has become a part of me. Each time I read a physical book, I wonder what part of me I have left behind. How did you arrive at such an interesting concept?
So that was back in the days when I was still a war correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. And I was in Sarajevo during the siege of the city. And that was all wars are horrible in their own ways, but that was a war against an idea. And the idea was that people of different faiths and cultures could live together in a successful society. So it was a war against the idea of Sarajevo as a place where multi-ethnic society had flourished. And when you make war against an idea, you not only have to kill the people, you have to destroy the record that society existed. So they were bombing the libraries deliberately and the museums deliberately. And I heard about this missing treasure of the Sephardic Jewish world, this incredible illustrated manuscript that had survived the expulsion of the Jews from Spain and had survived the Pope's Inquisition in Venice and had survived the Nazi ransacking of Sarajevo in World War II. And during the Bosnian War, it was missing and nobody knew where it was. And that just intrigued me so much. And when I learned later that a Muslim librarian had risked his life and gone in under shelling to get that book and bring it to a safe hiding place, I just knew it was a story for me.
Mm-hmm. Librarians are superheroes.
They are. They were really superheroes in that city, you know. So Ada Butorovic is one of the people I mentioned in the afterword because she died evacuating books from the Sarajevo library under shelling.
So I'm going to ask some questions that I would typically ask in the last few minutes so that we have time to go back to some of the questions that might be spoilers. We have several people asking about what, including Martha, if you could share what you're researching now and what we might expect next from you.
Yeah, I can't really yet because I'm going to do something a little bit different next, and it's nonfiction, and I don't really want to talk about it yet. And then I have this other historical novel idea, but I haven't really started on the work for it, and it'll be another year before I do. So I feel like it's too soon. So the only thing I can say about it is it's a novel inspired by a piece of furniture.
A piece of furniture?
Yes.
Interesting. Okay. Christy is saying, did winning the Pulitzer Prize for March change your life, and did it affect or inform your writing in a different way?
It made me a little bit more relaxed.
Okay.
You know, people said, "Oh, don't you feel a lot of pressure now?" I said, "No, the opposite." It's like, okay, I'm good to go now. It was so unexpected. I mean, it was the craziest thing because I remember when I got the call from a friend who'd been an editor of mine on the Wall Street Journal, and he said, "This is so great, this is fantastic," and I didn't have a clue what he was talking about. It was 3:00 in the afternoon, and this was a guy I knew to like a long lunch, and I thought he'd been having one, and I said, "You know, what are you talking about?" And he said, "You don't know you've won the Pulitzer Prize?" And I said, "Don't be silly, I can't have won the Pulitzer Prize, I haven't done any journalism." And you know, I basically hung up on him, and then the phone immediately rang again, and you know, I realized that they were talking about my novel March, and I thought it was a mistake, frankly. But then I was still on the phone, and there's a knock on the door, and somebody's bringing a big flower arrangement, and my young son opened the door and said, "Mum can't come now. She's really busy. She just got the Pulitzer prize."
That's really cute. Anne is asking, your stories bring historical periods to life in such vivid ways. What historical era that you've explored in your writing has been the easiest to write about, and which one has been the hardest?
Oh, definitely the hardest is when you go back before recorded history. So the secret chord about King David, really hard. Never going to do that again. You know, you're looking at a few pot shards. That's what you've got. You haven't got letters. You haven't got journals. You haven't got a sense of how people were thinking. So that was the hardest. And the period that I like is this period I have written 2 books set in, which is the 17th century, because it's the emergence of the modern mind. but the medieval mind is still there. And so there's all kinds of beliefs in magic and superstition. But the modern mind, the recognizable mind, the people who laughed at the same things that we find funny, they're starting to emerge. And so I like that. I like the tension between the two.
Yeah, that is pretty interesting. So what books do you recommend or are you currently reading that everyone should run to the library to check out?
Wow, big question. Okay, so the last book that blew my hair back has been out for a couple of years now, but that was The Overstory by Richard Powers. I absolutely love that. Anyone who hasn't read it, you're in for a treat. I recently read a book that is out in Australia and will be out here early in the new year called The Sun Walks Down. Fantastic story. It's set in 19th century Australia, and the plot is driven by the search for a child who has got lost from his family's property in the outback, and all kinds of interwoven relationships in the town. Very interesting and beautifully written. What else? What else? What else? I liked Sorrow and Bliss quite a bit. That's another Australian novel that's available here. And it's an unusual novel because it's a comic novel about depression, which is pretty hard to pull off, but she does it beautifully.
All right. So I think at this time, I just want to let everybody know that I'm going to ask a couple of questions since we had so many questions from pre-submissions about the ending. And I don't want to spoil it for anyone who hasn't finished the book yet. So if you haven't finished the book, you can feel free to leave the room. You can feel free to mute. You can feel free to leave the talk altogether. But this is me rambling to give you enough time to make that decision, to decide how you want to deal with a spoiler. But we did have so many passionate questions about it, so I want to ask at least one question. So from Kathy, she says, did you know from the onset how you would end the contemporary story? I loved the book, but wanted to throw it across the room when Theo was killed. Thinking more about it in retrospect, I felt it was so much more of a truer picture of the tragic reality of young Black men, though.
I had no idea that that was where this was going at all. In fact, I was very confused about what I was going to do with the relationship. So I was just writing and writing and taking it on trust. And as I said earlier in our talk, I had this total catastrophe in my own life when my husband of 35 years, who was, as far as we knew, completely healthy, went to the gym 6 days a week, just died. He was on book tour himself for his book, Spying on the South. And the shock of that and the grief that came with it, when I finally got back to writing this book, I think it colored everything that happened after it. And I think the whole last half of the book is just saturated with the grief that I was feeling. And that, in turn, I think drove the plot in the direction that it went.
Okay. Do you think the tone of the last half of your book is it's obvious that it's changed?
I don't know. That's for readers to know. I know that I came back to the book a very different person.
Okay.
And so, I was writing as a person who wasn't theorizing anymore
Mm-hmm.
about loss. I was feeling it.
Yeah. Okay. And then back to Betty's question, how did you decide on the job that brought Jess back to Australia?
Well, that guy actually exists and he just amuses the hell out of me. And that museum is the wildest, most fascinating museum I have ever been in. And he really is a guy who made his fortune to buy all this art from having a system for betting on horses. So when I'm thinking about horses and art, he was at the top of my mind. And I just thought, yeah, that's the kind of crazy thing he would do.
Okay. All right. Well, we are just past the hour. Thank you for the talk tonight. It was very enlightening. It was enjoyable. I had a lot of fun. Thank you so much for being here. With that, I also want to extend a huge thank you to all of our viewers for tuning in to our author talk tonight with Geraldine Brooks. Without your support, none of this would be possible, and we thank you for choosing to spend your time with your library. As a reminder, below the live stream video, you can find a link to Geraldine's book. We look forward to seeing you all later this week on December 10th when we have a conversation with Frederick Bachman about his newest book, The Winners. And again, for our final talk of 2022, when we chat with Pulitzer Prize-winning author Dr. Nicole Eustace about her book, Covered with Night, A Story of Murder and Indigenous Justice in Early America. You can register for these and lots of other great events on your library's event page. I am Brandon Adler, and thank you for joining us. Have a good night.